Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to Parenting in the 21st Century. My name is Zina Shevchik and I'll be your host today. We have with us today Dr. Stephen Birchak, Professor of Educational Counseling at the College of St. Rose. Dr. Birchak, besides being a teacher, is also a professional speaker who's well known in the area for his presentations on such topics as violence prevention, character education, and building resilience in children. Dr. Birchak is also the author of How to Build a Child's Character by Tapping into Your Own. Welcome, Dr. Birchak. Thank you for coming today. I would like to start our conversation, if we may, talking about how to parent children in a society, in my opinion, permeated by violence, whether it's violence on television, computers, in our homes, on the school bus, or in the schoolyard. And my first question might be, is there indeed a growing evidence of violence in our culture, or is it just something that the media presents to us to have airspace to fill, because they have airspace to fill?
Well, first of all, I want to say, Zina, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it very much. It's an honor to be able to talk about these kinds of things. And, I think your question is a great start, because one of the things that we do know from research is that while violence, in many ways, it has increased, and depends on how we define it, and I can talk a little bit about that. What we do know is that in the media, the coverage of violence and aggression has increased in volume by 600% in the last decade. So one of the things I'm saying is that we might actually get a skewed view of what life is like out there. And very often you'll hear people say, goodness, where's all the feel-good stories? And so I think that there is a lot more that's reported. Does that mean that there is more in our culture? Is there more in life? I think that there is some rise in aggressive behavior, because I think there's some rise in tension.
Okay. So your experience being out there speaking to teachers or parents, do you get a sense that they're more afraid? I realize that in the last 5 years since 9/11 and the talk of war on terror, that it would be, assumption would be probably correct, that people express more concern. But do you see that in your daily or weekly presentations or contact with students even?
Well, I think that one of the things that I am seeing a lot more of, and I think that this is very clear in our society today, we have a really high-tech, rush world. And there is a sense of disconnect between people and each other, on the jobs, in the homes, out in society. And we know from our very nature as human beings is that we're wired to be connected. In other words, when my kids were growing up, where they had this dog Andy, and the dog would hear the school bus and he would just start flipping out, because that's what he was wired to do, is that he's a pack animal and he just loves to be around the kids and he loves to be around the family. Well, that's us human beings too. We're wired to be connected to each other. And what happens, and what has happened, is that there's been a sense of disconnect. And there's disconnect in our social circles. There's a disconnect in the way that we relate to each other. And what happens when we become disconnected from a culture, we become disconnected from a society, is there's really only one alternative, is that we create our own rules. In other words, and I can preface this a little bit by saying, when we're born, we have one primary connection, one or two, mom or dad, early on. And from attachment theory, we know these attachments that we have to the adults in our lives are so important. Around the age of 6, maybe a little bit earlier for some kids these days, they go into daycare, or they go to a school. They create another major attachment in their life. Then, around 10, 11, peer groups become the most important thing on earth. And we know these three things is what we call the triangle of healthy connections, parents or schools, peers, that if you have 2 out of 3 of those things, that you have a virtual lock-on success in life. Now, I'm not saying a good chance, an 80% chance, 90%. What I'm saying is if you have 2 out of 3 healthy connections, parents, school, peers, that you've got a lock on success in life. That doesn't mean you're not going to get parking tickets or file for bankruptcy or get a divorce one day or whatever. You will have your normal bumps in the roads, but you're not going to have major violations with authority or problems with life. And these connections are so very important. And I know I'm kind of taking a long way around your question.
I totally understand.
But the idea that what's happening in the media and what's happening to our human connections, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. And we start to think about, is there more violence in the world? There's obviously more tension. And maybe another thing that we want to consider is, how do you define violence? And I do violence prevention workshops for educators, for all of the education majors at the College of St. Rose, and I also go out to schools and school districts throughout the state. And the first place I start is I tell them, expand your definition of violence. You've got to expand your definition of violence because, and I'll give you an example, is that I had a relative who had gone through a horrible divorce, and in the aftermath she had said, my goodness, I never considered him to be violent because he never laid a hand on me. And she said, in retrospect, I realized he was really violent. And what we were talking about was verbal abuse,
Right.
psychological abuse, an oppression, had to know where she was at. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And what she said, I always thought of violence as fists, guns, and knives. And I realized that he was very violent with me. He was very aggressive with me. And you could tell in the language and the anger that was in the household. And she realized that violence comes in lots of forms. And the reason why I say I preface it with that is because if you walk into a household and you see a parent tearing a child to shreds, verbally and psychologically abusing this child. You see someone in a grocery store. You walk into a school and you see this teacher standing over this kid. I contend that's aggression toward a child. And so we sometimes mask it. And aggression is out there. There's a lot of aggression. And there is, I think, an increase in it. And I think that it becomes rather subtle, and I think that we have to be aware of what messages we're giving to our kids. And the bottom line is this: if our children inherit a world that is more aggressive, more violent than the one they came into, whose fault is it?
Right.
It's us. We're the ones in charge. We're the adults. We're the guys that are making this world for them.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, or maybe I'm making the assumptions, you let me know. You're talking about parental modeling and how we behave, as well as, I think, what we can do to insist on nonviolent behavior between members of our family and maybe our kids and their peer groups or their behavior in school. I'm assuming this, to me, is all parenting, part of parenting. Am I right?
Absolutely. However, one of the things I'll say that it's not just limited to parenting behaviors. It's all adult behaviors. And just last week, I'm in a class with graduate students, and we were talking about civility. And a woman who was a mother, she says that she was driving along last week, and she's driving down the street, and she had to slam on her brakes really fast. And her little 3-year-old is in the back seat. And immediately when she slams on her brakes, her little 3-year-old says, "You stupid jerk!" screams out like this. And so she said, "Oh my goodness." And she realized in that moment that this child is learning that anytime somebody upsets mom's apple cart, anytime somebody upsets mom, that there's somebody out there in this world that's a stupid jerk. And she said, "Oh my goodness, this is what my child is learning about how to relate to the world, is that every time mom slams on the brakes, somebody out there is a stupid jerk." And she said it really forced her to begin to think, what am I doing that's modeling these behaviors to my child? Because here it is, this little kid's starting to learn a number of things about the way the world operates.
Right. I have to say, as a parent myself, it's so hard to combat what our kids see on television. And first of all, they get so much of their, as you said, at 10, 11, their peers become more important, at least for a while,
Yeah.
than their parents. It's so hard to combat what's happening within the teenagers in particular, peer group and how they relate to each other. And so often it seems to me they're modeling what they see on television in particular. Yeah. And I often, when I was bringing my teenagers up, had to say, perhaps that's how you speak to your peers or your friends, but you cannot speak that way to me. And but I know that's not controlled, for example, on the bus, in the cafeteria, in the hallways of the schools, and that always, I always felt like I was losing the battle. I mean, in the end, I feel I won, but my kids are almost virtually grown up now. Yeah. But it's just such a day-to-day struggle, and so that's what I hope talking to you will give hope to some parents, that it is worth that there is some light at the end of a tunnel when you have to do it on a daily basis, fight the media and fight the peers. So.
Absolutely, and I think you bring up a good point. You say we're watching television, what do we see out there? And I think it is a changing world, and I don't think that we fully understand the impact that this changing world is having on our children. And sometimes it creeps up on us, and sometimes it takes us by surprise. We say, did I just see that on TV or on the internet or whatever? And the example, actually, I wrote about this in the book a little bit, is that I remember growing up, and I know this dates me as what I watched back in the 60s, but I remember whether it would be Gunsmoke or Andy of Mayberry or whatever. But I was watching just a primetime sitcom, and somebody come walking into the little cafe, and she looks at her friend. This is a primetime sitcom, one of the best, one of the most highly rated. She looks at her friend and she says, "You had sex today. I can tell by the look on your face." And she says that, and I'm thinking, goodness gracious, imagine if Mr. Brady on the Brady Bunch walked in and said to Alice today, "Alice, and I can tell by the look on your face." Well, we would have been appalled at something like that, but it becomes so subtle, and we hear more and more of it. And also, I begin to wonder what this does to the mind of a child. Just this morning's paper in the Times-Union, they were talking about the access to pornography on the internet, and the fact that all of these different age groups are having so much more access than ever before, mostly by accident. And I think that we are in a time where we have to also understand that information doesn't save a child. You remember there was a time when we would say, if we give kids enough information on drugs, they're going to make good decisions. Or we give them enough information on sexuality, they're going to make good decisions. And what we have come to realize, too, is that information doesn't save anyone. It's what do you do with that information? Because if information saved us, of course, we would be the most saved society on earth.
That's for sure.
We have so much information, but it's what we do with that information. And so part of what I do, and what I talk about a lot, is that we have to think about whatever those behaviors we want in children, we have to think about those things in ourselves. Yeah. And there are major differences between violent and nonviolent people. And there are major differences in whether you're 4 years old or whether you're 84 years old. They're the same things. And that very thing that I mentioned, like the mother, she was saying that her little 3-year-old, and what she was demonstrating or modeling to her child, one of those major differences is impulse control. If you talk to any teacher, any parent who's out there, working with a tough kid, or a teacher who's working in the trenches with really tough kids, what do they talk about every day? Impulse control, impulse control, impulse control. Kids keeping their hands to themselves, boundaries, not lashing out at other children. And you'll notice that in the most miserable adults they can't stop themselves. They're screaming at people on the highway, and And hence we created road rage. You know, you and I didn't even grow up with the term road rage. We had to invent that for the knuckleheads on the highway. Now we have road rage, office rage, email rage, and we have these assorted rages because we have to identify the behaviors that are taking place out there in our culture.
Now, is that something, the lack of or impulse control, is that something that is both genetic and learned, or is it, I mean, can you, I know when my daughters went to school, it seemed like they were nice, quiet, behaved girls, and often they were put next to boys who had no sense of boundaries.
Yeah.
And you know, as a parent, I needed to intervene a little bit occasionally. And is that something? I assumed then that this impulse control or perhaps was just genetically, developmentally came into being later in boys, for example, or is it something that's more learned when you talk about impulse control? Because I think you're talking about a psychological term. I'm not sure, a biological term.
Well, impulse control really, we know from some of the research about ADHD is that they have a little bit of difficult time with the brakes, putting on the brakes, stopping themselves in certain situations. However, we also know that there's children who can actually train themselves to be stopped. In other words, I walked into a gym one time and this child was running around and pulling every kid's hat down over their head, and the mother stops and says, "Please don't mind my child, you know, he's got attention deficit disorder," as though that absolved him from any guilt. Well, there's a difference between not being able to stop yourself and also being socially appropriate in those circles. You know, my kids grew up. One of their friends is a wonderful young man. Was just about the most attention deficit kid I ever knew on earth. This kid just bounced off the walls, and that's the way his mind worked. However, he was very, very, very socially appropriate, and he knew, for instance, if he was being socially appropriate or inappropriate, even though he had this attention deficit. So we have to separate out the two, because one is a behavior about boundaries that we teach children on how to treat each other, and for that they need great role models in all of their adults in their lives, as well as peer groups. But then the other, I think, is a sort of a biological condition that we, you know, kind of this on edge, I'm stimulated by everything in my environment. So that impulse control, I think part of it is something that's our nature, but also there's a huge piece of that we learn to be socially appropriate.
Right. Okay. When you talk to teachers and in the schools, moving from parenting to the schools, what do the schools think is their role? I mean, we'll talk very generically, you know. What I sense that there seems to be a bit of a backing off of responsibility on the part of the schools in some cases, and as far as what goes on in the hallways or the cafeterias or the school buses. And is this something that, you know, parents, you think, should, you know, get involved with? I just, as a parent, I've always felt that my kids maybe weren't as safe as they should have been, free from violence, whether it be by, you know, speech or physical activity in those environments. And I never quite knew as a parent what I should be doing about it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'll point out right off the bat is that, you know, I mentioned the triangle of healthy connections that we have of parent, school, and peers. Is that very often when I speak to parents, they'll say, you know, if these schools were just doing their job, and then I'll talk to schools, and the schools will say, if these parents were just doing their job. And one of the things that I say to both groups is, let's be careful, because I think that we're all on the same page. We're all in the best interest of the child, and we all want very good things for these children. So we have to understand, but also realize that you own a corner of that triangle. So no matter how much you want to blame society or schools or parents or whatever, each of these segments, school owns a corner of the triangle, and so do parents. And the other thing I'll say about schools, though, is in regard to that, since Columbine, I think that there's no other segment of our culture that's had a greater learning curve, quicker, than schools. And schools have said we need to take enormous responsibility for these children. And schools are doing a lot of the right things. And they have programs now. We talk about everything from lockdowns to whatever to protect these children. And I think they're doing a lot of the right things. And in fact, what I do believe about schools, and these are great questions for parents to ask because parents can get themselves involved in parent-teacher groups and say, what can we do for the character education as well? What can we do to help these children with character education? And all persons play a part in this, but schools are doing a tremendous job. And in fact, there's character education programs that are being instituted at many, many schools right now. They're talking about what character looks like and how we train ourselves in character and how kids develop more character. And I think also one of the things that schools are doing a lot of too is that they're starting to address what does the character look like within effective teachers, and how are we going to institute that? And I'll give you an example. Is because I know a lot of people feel like the world is out of control and schools are out of control and the situation's out of control. And I have a very dear friend of mine who's a principal down in Washington, D.C. His name is Phil Catania. And Phil's school was one of the most well-known in the country as it was a nationally recognized model for what he did with this school. He came into this school district, one of the highest violent school districts in the country, and children in this area, this neighborhood, were joining gangs, one of the most violent gangs in the country, that in order to be inducted into this gang, you had to take a machete and lop off a part of another human being for your initiation into that gang. It's a really violent area. And as he came into this school, somewhere around 6 kids a day were being suspended. This is an elementary school. 6 kids a day for violence. And they gave him the run. They said, you know, you as a principal, here's what we want you to do. We want you to reduce violence. And he said, fine, let me have free run of this place, what I'm going to do. He brought in all the faculty, and he said, here's what we're going to do, folks. First of all, we're going to get to know each other's names. When you see each other in the hallway, I want you to greet each other. I want you to treat each other the way you would like to be treated. He brought in the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, the hall monitors, everyone. And he said, I want you to know these kids' names, and I want you to greet them. He says, because we're going to start with our own examples. He said, another policy I'm going to have, he said, 90% of the kids who get sent to my office, they better be sent there for something good. And he said he would stop in the middle of the day and he would have an announcement, a kid did this, a kid did that. But he said he started the culture. They put it up on their sign outside the school. This is, Johnson Elementary, a peaceful school. They started answering their phones. This is Johnson Elementary, a peaceful school. They put it on their letterhead. He brought in the parents, and they didn't get rid of all the violence. But one of the things that they did is that they started to count up their peace days. And toward the end of his tenure at that school, all but 5 days out of the year were able to be called what they called a peaceful day. Not a single fight on the bus, in the school, on the way home, or in those kids' neighborhoods. Because if he heard about a fight, the next day he'd say, we have to take away a peace day. But the kids started to use the language. He said a new kid got transferred in their school, and he overheard a little kindergartner, and one kid smacked the kid there at lunchtime. He says, we don't do that here at Johnson Elementary. We're a peaceful school. And he said what he wanted to do is he wanted to infiltrate in every way. And he said, now I know I can't change their homes, their neighborhoods, but this is the area that we have control over. This is our school. We will set the boundaries for this school. And he had little things that he did. He stood in the doorway, and he said he had a policy. He had to touch every kid when they come into school. Some are high-fiving, some are shaking his hands. Other kids would run up and give him a slobbery hug every morning. But he said these are the things he did to connect to his kids. And he said after a while, when we took the tension off all these insane tests and test scores, and we got we're a school in danger, he said that we began to perform at a higher level because we talked about character first. And I think this is a great lesson for any organization, even a family, is to say, let's put these scores by the wayside and let's talk about each other first. In other words, look at what we do today. Kid comes walking in the door, we don't say, what did you learn today? We say, what did you get? Yeah. Oh, I got a B, I got an A. Kid starts to learn that the score is more important than the principle of learning. It's a dangerous place to be. Yeah.
And as parents, I'm sure we don't even realize it. I assume that teachers should be more aware, but as many people have said before me, you know, you don't need any education to be a parent. I mean, anybody can have a child, but to actually be a good parent is something, unfortunately, that not many of us take any kind of classes for. This is, I think, a great segue into talking a little bit about what is in your book. How to build a child's character by tapping into your own. I certainly see a lot of parallels here, and also your other major topic that I see from your website that you're involved with, which is building resilience in children. And so to me, if we're bringing children into what seems to be a rather violent, or at least, what shall I say, rude, impolite world, to help them at home to become resilient, to deal with some of these issues that they're going to have to when they leave, at least leave their home. So would you talk a little bit about the ways to build resilience, and obviously the character you've already talked about, how a teacher's character, a parent character can role model into building their children's character. But would you talk a little bit about the resilience?
Sure. And in the book I talk about, in the major chapters, I talk about civility for one thing, as something that we need to have in order to give to our children. And what I emphasize all the way through the book is that you can't teach something that you don't already have. You can't give away something you don't already have. And we have to have a conscience. We have to develop our own resilience. We have to develop collaboration. We have to develop human kinship within children. And whenever I talk to parents too, I know that they feel like this is a rush world. And I start with time and say that, the one thing that we know for sure is that life has a beginning and it has an end, and it's very temporary. And the time that we spend with each other is not all the same. And I talk about what we can do to improve the quality of the time that we have with our children. And I also tell parents, I said, don't think that just because you're driving a kid to soccer practice or through the drive-up McDonald's that this is quality time, because in fact, it isn't. If you're asking them, did you get your homework done? Did you get the backyard cleaned up? Did you get your room cleaned up? That's not quality time. That's interrogation time. Quality time is sitting down across from your child at a dinner table and not saying, did you get your homework done, but tell me about your day. And that's wholly different than, say, supervised time. And I distinguish between the two because I think there's supervision time. There's time that we spend that we're just in the household and other kids are around, and maybe there's an adult around. But there's several different ways that we spend our time with children. And quality time in and of itself has no tasks involved. It has no end result. It's not an interrogating them about did they get this done or did they, but tell me about your day. And I myself even learned as kids were younger, they were more interested in telling me about these things, and then all of a sudden they reach adolescence and they say, so tell me, how was your day? They give you that universal shrug that says, I don't know. And so I had to get more creative with my questions. I say, okay guys, let's do a quick round around the table here. It says, who's the most obnoxious person you ran into today? Oh, well, let me tell you about my math teacher. And then they start telling you about their world. But that's what we want to know from each other, because then I share with them, the obnoxious people that I work with too. But that's where we grow in our quality of our relationships, not these tasks that have to get done. Or let's get to softball or soccer practice. And quality time is so important because that's that time where there's no real pressure on each other about the kinds of things that we need to get done. And so the other thing I tell parents is they'll say, well, we just don't have time. We're just so busy. Well, my calendar, when my kids were growing up, high school, I had a high school diver. And he's off at meets every day of the week. He also was in gymnastics. The other was in wrestling and weightlifting. And oh my goodness, you look at our calendar. But one of the things we did every Sunday is we said, okay, guys, first of all, we look at the week and say how many days we're all going to be together for dinner. And I say, and the four of us, starting in junior high school, each one of them had to take a night where they cooked. And you cook, you don't have to do the dishes that night. So if my son cooked, then the rest of the other three of us would do the dishes. And we would sort out our meals for the week and who's going to cook and who's going to. But we would think about how we were going to eat as many sit-down meals as possible. Not in front of the TV, because we're all staring in one direction. We certainly can't see each other. And so it was very careful that we tried to do that. And I think that one of the things that it did is that it allowed for us to have those kinds of times together. And so it's something we have to think about and carefully construct. What are we going to do with our time around our children? And there's really no excuse. And if you find that you don't have time for those things, and you really need to cut this up a little bit different and say, well, how much time do I need to run them around to ballet and to singing and to dancing and to everything else if it's at the expense of each other?
Right. You've been really full of great ideas and thoughts, and starting a conversation, I hope, in many people's homes about all these issues. And I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Dr. Birchak, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
And we're going to have on our program at the end here a display of your book, How to Build a Child's Character by Tapping into Your Own. I want to thank everyone for joining us today with Dr. Stephen Birchak, a professor at the College of St. Rose and a professional speaker about character education, about violence prevention, and building resilience in children. Thank you very much.